It's Duchess Adalite here, and we are having another Virtual Atlantia meet. And I'm really excited because we're doing our first cultural diversity meeting tonight. And it is on a culture that I have a feeling not many people know about, or at the very least know little about. And I would like to introduce to you Arad Inanna. I did it! All right. I'm so proud of myself. I'm terrible with names. So thanks, first off, for just joining us here and telling us a little bit about yourself and this culture. So give me a high-level overview of the Neo-Sumerian culture.
All righty, high level. Well, the Neo-Sumerian culture is one that developed in Mesopotamia in the early to mid-Bronze Age, carrying over a lot of the culture from previous civilizations like Sumer, the Akkadian Empire. It really sort of set the stage for some of the major players in the later Bronze Age and even Iron Age Near East. It influenced Babylon, the Assyrian Empire, even a little bit of the Persian Empire. So it was a pretty influential culture, contemporary with the Indus Valley civilization, with the Old Kingdom of Egypt, and there was a surprising deal of trade that went on between all of those cultures in the history. It's one that I have found to be really fascinating because it has been such a challenge to actually research it. There's not as much out there in the sort of day-to-day sources. I've had to really dig into things like archaeological journals, scholarly articles, databases, books, but it's been a lot of fun to really dig into and kind of tackle that challenge.
Awesome. So one of the questions that we discussed prior to this meeting was, why did you choose the Bronze Age Near East? What made you get interested in this culture?
So there's a lot of different reasons. I originally started in the SCA back in 2013, focusing on the New Kingdom of Egypt, because as a kid, I absolutely loved Egypt, was fascinated by it, had every kind of book on mummies you can imagine. So I had a huge passion for it ever since I was a child. Also, looking at it as a complete newbie to the SCA, it was a surprisingly low threshold to get into at a relatively high level of historical authenticity. The Bronze Age, especially if you go back into the earlier periods, is basically wrapped garments and jewelry and eyeliner, lots and lots of eyeliner. And for someone who appreciates historical accuracy and research, for me, I was like, well, this is a great way to do it. And also, Trimaris is really, really hot. So yeah.
Yes, I agree. Trimaris is extremely hot. I took advice from you this last year at Penzic on some Egyptian styling, and that made my daytime awfully better.
Yep.
So tell me a little bit about the lifespan of this culture. How long was it? From what time frame to what? And did it have longevity, or was it short?
So it, compared to other empires of the age, was a bit shorter lived. It existed for a couple of centuries, but that is really what I found in my studies of the Mesopotamian region, kind of the norm. It's interesting to have studied Egypt so in depth and now be studying Mesopotamia, because for Egypt, their culture and government and society really remain pretty much stable for literal millennia. Whereas in Mesopotamia, it's a much more volatile region politically, socially, even naturally, due to things like seismic activity and flooding. So there's a lot more of shifting power between different city-states, kings, ethnic groups. Like I said, the Neo-Sumerian Empire really was born out of the earlier Sumerian dynasties that were later conquered by the Akkadians and conquered by the Gutians. And, even after they established their empire, they were then conquered by the Elamites, and then it gave rise to Babylon. And it's a much more chaotic region. So they weren't terribly long-lived, only about a couple of centuries. We're talking towards, my persona is solidly at about 2050 BCE. So pretty early on as well.
Okay, so it was sort of short,
Mhm.
but is there any impact that the culture had that kept going through further into history, into other cultures? And is there anything today that we can see still that they've made contributions towards?
Yes, absolutely. The Neo-Sumerian culture, which again borrows a lot from the earlier Sumerian culture, had a profound impact on the region. They were one of the first, if perhaps not the first, documented human civilizations. So they created things like agriculture, writing, engineering. The Sumerian influence really is what helped to inspire and influence later cultures like the Babylonians to create more advanced mathematics. They opened up a lot of trade in the Near East. The Akkadian Empire, which a lot of the Neo-Sumerian culture utilized, actually expanded their territory. It was the first empire in human history, and it expanded territory from the Mediterranean all the way to the Persian Gulf. So they helped to facilitate trade from India into the Mediterranean world, Egypt, the Minoans. We can actually trace elements from Sumerian culture, the Mesopotamian region, even into things like Europe, finding beads and bits of goods that would have been traded that far away from them. So far as their influences that survive today, a lot of it, of course, has been subsumed by other cultures, but the Sumerians were really the basis for law. Everyone knows Hammurabi's laws, but those were largely based on the law codes of Ur-Nammu, who was one of the earliest Neo-Sumerian kings. The Sumerians really helped to create things that we rely upon and maybe don't credit them quite so much as, because other civilizations improved upon them and we credit those civilizations, which is another reason why I enjoy the Bronze Age. It's because we can really see where an empire like Rome maybe got to where it was because cultures like Egypt and Sumeria paved the way for it.
So you made a comment. You said everybody knows what the Humbari laws are. I don't know what the Humbari laws are. So give me a little bit of information about that.
So the law code of Hammurabi actually comes from the Babylonians. It was essentially a series of laws that really served to codify a legal system so that people could have just representation based on the crimes that were committed. We don't certainly think of them today as necessarily modern laws, because certainly some of the ones in there were things like, oh, if a builder builds your house and your house collapses, the life of the builder's son is then forfeit because he screwed up. Certainly not what we would consider necessarily in our modern sensibilities just laws, but it did give a lot more order to, again, what was a very otherwise chaotic and sometimes violent region. The law codes of Hammurabi were so influential in legal systems that they actually, I believe, appear in frieze on the Supreme Court of the United States, along with Moses and the Ten Commandments, and other figures who have, throughout history, been lawgivers.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, so you said that they had kingdoms, and then you also said they had city-states. So can I infer from that that they eventually became ruled by one singular individual at some point? And if that's the case, what kind of government did they actually have?
Excellent question. In the early dynastic period, it was primarily individual city-states kind of vying for preeminence, almost similar to what you'd see in the classical Greek period. Just like Athens and Sparta, you had Lagash and Umma way back in the day fighting over irrigation canals. what really brought the region together was Sargon of Akkad, because he was from a northern city, and through military conquest, essentially came down and unified all the southern city-states of Mesopotamia until he reached the Persian Gulf, creating one of the earliest, if not the first, empires in human history. And even though his empire did eventually collapse after his death, it would pave the way for the Neo-Sumerian empires, who would be centered in the city of Ur, and would have a centralized king versus the regional city rulers that were more common in earlier periods.
Thanks for that. That makes a lot more sense. Now, what about, you mentioned Egypt earlier. So so give me the Egypt versus Mesopotamia. What is the differences between the two?
So there are several differences between the two. I've remarked a little bit on how Mesopotamia was a lot less unified in general than Egypt. Really, Egypt, throughout most of its history, was fairly unified, even in periods when it wasn't, because it was a case of Upper and Lower Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Neo-Sumerians, you would always have individual city-states with local rulers, the Enses, who would always be vying for power of their own. And then in later periods, even though you did have the kings, the Lugals, who had that centralized authority, they didn't wield it completely, say, as like the pharaoh did in Egypt, where he was a living god. The kings in Mesopotamia very much had to enforce their rule, whether it be through military conquest or sometimes through other means. Sargon of Akkad actually installed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god Inanna in Ur, and that really helped to cement his authority there by placing her in such an important cultural position. Also, fun fact, Enheduanna is actually the first recorded author in human history and the first female author ever. She's credited for several hymns to the moon god. So pretty awesome.
Okay, so while we're on the topic of women, so you said that he put her into a very high-end role, that she was very important in their culture. So what other roles did women play? Were there any women who ruled? Were there any women who had governmental rights? How did that work?
So that is an area that I'm still exploring and researching more. Women did seem, from what I've seen thus far, to have a fair degree of autonomy and authority, especially earlier in the history of the region. Women were able to serve in fairly high-ranking positions like that, and it seems that there, to a certain degree, was a practice of having female high priestesses of male gods, and also vice versa. But in terms of their socioeconomic power, they did have a bit more autonomy than we would see in later periods and in later cultures. Again, it's not an area that I've gotten to explore a lot, but I actually have been able to find some articles, scholarly articles specifically about royal women, noble women. Some of the best archaeological examples we have from Mesopotamia are from the tombs of women, such as the Queen Puabi, who was buried with as much treasure as Tutankhamun was in Egypt. And it's pretty impressive to see some of the stuff that she had. So definitely women did have a certain degree of power and authority, and I will certainly be excited to find out more of the specific nuances of that as I research the history of the place more.
So I kind of want to go right into religion and magic. You mentioned gods. So did they have a hierarchical structure like Greek gods, where Zeus is at the top of the food chain and it trickles down from there? And also give us some examples of the various gods and goddesses, I'm assuming, that they had.
Absolutely. They definitely did have a certain hierarchy to their religion. Some of the most important gods were the Anunnaki, essentially some of the most close descendants of the primary god, who was An. An was sort of the god of the sky, very similar almost in a way to Ra being the god of the sun in Egypt, who then later passed on his power to Osiris. In Mesopotamian religion, with the Sumerians and Neo-Sumerians, it very much was Enlil who was king of the gods, god of thunder, storms, the wind, that sort of thing. So similar to Zeus with a kind of sky father archetype, but there were other very important gods. Enki, the god of waters and wisdom, was a very prominent figure in their mythology. The moon god Nana, the sun god Utu, though my personal favorite and the goddess for who I'm named is, of course, the goddess Inanna, who is the goddess of war and sex. A very fascinating figure within their mythology, which is interesting because it seems like Inanna's role was fairly minor early in their history, but after the rule of the Akkadians, she really achieved a sort of greater power and authority, features in a lot more myths. And she's a very interesting figure because she has such a dualistic aspect to her. Almost like Sekhmet in Egyptian mythology, who is a goddess of war, but then becomes Hathor, goddess of love. Inanna is a very powerful and ambitious, almost grasping, scheming figure. There's a great story about how she decides to descend to the underworld and gets trapped there. And after being freed because of her contingency plans, she's forced to choose someone to take her place in the underworld and ends up consigning her lover, Dumuzid, to her fate because he failed to mourn her properly after her death. So definitely a very interesting and powerful woman. There's another great story as part of the Epic of Gilgamesh where she comes to the hero and essentially tells him that she wants him to become her lover. And Gilgamesh, being a smart guy, is like, no, thank you. I've seen what happens to some of the other guys who you've dated. And so she sends a monstrous celestial bull to attack his city. Again, very Greco-Roman-esque in terms of the different quirks of these deities. They played a major role in the lives of their day-to-day people. And even though the temples, of course, were a place only for the priests, the power of these gods was truly felt by everyone on a day-to-day basis, and it was believed had a very real impact in their lives.
Well, I think I need to take some lessons from her on how to handle situations. I think that she has a lot to teach us. So you didn't touch on magic, though. So is there any sort of, I don't know if I would call it witchcraft at that time, maybe sorcery?
They had quite an active magic practice, and it's interesting really to see how they viewed it because something that I've noticed with a lot of the Bronze Age religion, occultism, it seems to follow a sort of thought process that magic isn't necessarily tied to a particular religion or god. Magic is viewed largely as a tool, a force of nature, almost like fire. It can be used for good or evil purposes. So very much unlike what we see later on in like the medieval and Renaissance period, where you have miracles that come from God and then witchcraft that comes from the devil. It was all the same stuff to them. And with the Mesopotamians, they had a lot of different applications for it. Certainly there was, the darker aspects of it, what some would call witchcraft, where, you could curse people, harm them, cause disease, death. But there were also dedicated practitioners to preventing that kind of magic. There were specific priests and healers who would perform essentially anti-witchcraft spells designed to nullify curses, reflect the magic back onto the caster who had sent it to harm someone. They had very active practices, and they utilized that in their religion, in their day-to-day lives. The Mesopotamians, all of the cultures in that region, have various magical practices. They use different forms of divination. They look to the heavens, of course, for inspiration. Astrology was very big in Mesopotamia, and what we know as the modern zodiac actually originally comes from the Babylonians before it was kind of adopted into the Greek lexicon. So, for example, Cancer the crab was actually the crayfish to the Mesopotamians, and they looked to the stars as sources of inspiration, which we can even see from stuff out of the Bible, where the three wise men come from the Near East to greet the newfound king. But again, all of those kind of magical practices have much earlier origins in cultures like the Neo-Sumerians, the Akkadians, that sort of thing.
So we've got a general background on the culture itself, the Neo-Sumerian culture. I want you now to tell me about Arad Inanna the Persona. Tell me about him and what his life was like.
Absolutely. So Arad Inanna was a high priest of the goddess Inanna, also a Gala priest, which is a very specific and interesting kind of priest in Inanna's cult. Essentially, Gala priests are priests that perform lamentations for the goddess. Which is interesting because in the Bronze Age Near East, lamentations were traditionally a female profession. And because of this, there's a lot of archaeological evidence to suggest that Gala priests did not fit into the traditional male-female gender binary. Gala priests seem to have existed on a spectrum where there were male Gala priests who were cis heteros who had wives and families. There were Gala priests who clearly engaged in homosexual activities. There's actually a proverb in which a Gala priest says that I must not arouse that which belongs to my mistress, speaking of certain relevant parts of his anatomy. And interestingly enough, the cuneiform sign for Gala comes from two different symbols, one which means penis and one which means anus. There's even a certain implication that some Gala priests may have been cross-dressers, may have been a transgender. So there's a broad spectrum among that priestly class that really goes to showcase how the ancients viewed gender and sex on a much greater spectrum than necessarily a lot of people believe. Now, Gala priests could be, depending on their rank, very powerful. We actually have records of one Gala priest from the Neo-Sumerian Empire who owned multiple properties across several cities. So he seemed to do pretty well for himself. And Arad Inanna does the same. You know, he has a fairly high ranking in the court. He coordinates the music performed at a lot of temple rituals with musicians, with singers. He, of course, would be able to sing himself, and I actually have learned to sing a little bit in Babylonian, which is technically post-period, but I think learning to sing in any kind of dead language is a struggle, so I'm going to give myself a creative anachronism on that one. But
you know I'm going to make you sing it now, right?
Absolutely. Would you like to hear a little bit of a hymn to Ishtar, or Inanna as she was known to the Sumerians?
Yes, I would. I absolutely would. And I hope everybody else is excited as I am to hear it. So
all right,
please.
All right. Il tam zumrara shubtilatim litahid belet nishi rabiti gigi Ishtar zumrara shubtilatim litahid belet nishi rabiti gigi. How's that?
That was absolutely beautiful. I don't even know what to say. I didn't know your voice was so great. Oh my goodness.
Thank you. Thank
fabulous.
Thank you.
Also, our closed caption was having a real struggle with all those words, so that's going to be real exciting as people go through
be happy to provide transliteration, because that actually comes from cuneiform tablets that we recovered from period, which were transliterated by an amazing artist and music group who put together a whole album, and the artist actually helped me to find the sources for those, because I was so impressed with her work and wanted to recreate it for the SEA.
That is amazing. So make sure you get me those links or that information, and we'll put it in for this video as well. That is very neat. Thank you for doing that.
Of course.
Okay, so what would a day in the life of your persona have been like? What would you get up in the morning? Give me your morning to your evening.
Well, certainly first thing in the morning would probably refresh, dress, prepare for the day. I'm actually currently working on a teaching display art sci about personal dress in the Neo-Sumerian period, utilizing some of my own personal garb to be able to teach about it. But after preparing for the day, it's likely that my persona would have gone straight to the temple complex of Inanna, where he would serve in various capacities. A lot of the calendar was certainly determined by religious worship. So depending on various festivals, holidays, the time of year, he could be performing major temple rites. Certainly there were, very much like Egypt, processions for the gods, holidays dedicated to them. He could also be engaged in other activities such as singing, coordinating music for temple activities. Based on the information that we have from the Gala priest that I mentioned previously, he seems to have also engaged in a side business of arranging music for the wealthy elite. So after my temple duties were done, or depending on how much I had to do that day, I may have engaged in other activities to bring in extra income for myself, or at the request of, say, the local ruler, the Ensi, the king, the Lugal, for my musical talents or to arrange musical talents. Very much like Egypt and the rest of the Bronze Age, Near East, and Mediterranean, music was something that frequently was a part of not just religious practice, but also their merry time, their banquets, their parties, and being able to have different types of entertainment there, whether it be singers, musicians, certainly someone like my persona who specialized in that kind of craft would have been able to arrange that and ensure that any of my colleagues in the wealthy elite would have had suitable entertainment for their own banquets. And I probably would have attended some of those myself in the evenings. We have wonderful banquet scenes from the earliest Sumerian cultures. For example, the Standard of Ur, which is this great box that's inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, showing people at banquets on chairs with their goblets, all the way up to the Assyrian period, where you see depictions of the king and queen in their garden, listening to music with their attendants. You see men seated on stools with lion-headed mugs. So feasting, banqueting, it was all very important to these cultures in Mesopotamia, and it's likely that I would have ended my day there, possibly even singing a song about beer to my colleagues, because we do actually have those as well, and they are quite amusing, just to compare them to maybe some of our modern day songs about drinking. Truly, the human condition has not changed in thousands of years.
So would your priests have had any governmental influence? Would they have, would the king have consulted with them in any way, shape, or form, discussed politics?
Most likely, yes. Since I am both high priest and a Gala priest, a chief Gala priest specifically, I certainly would have had access to not just the king, but local rulers as well. And it's certainly feasible that they would have consulted a person such as myself on matters of politics, because priests were of a high social class depending on the role and rank that they held. very much like you would see within the medieval period with bishops and cardinals, people who were in those social circles, regardless of if it was secular power or religious power, that certainly gave them an influence within society, and especially in the Bronze Age Near East, where priests were very much believed to speak directly for the gods or to the gods. Certainly that would have given them additional influence for things such as, say, if someone needed magical assistance or scholarly assistance, because of course all of the priests were also trained as professional scribes. They had to be able to read and write in order to perform their priestly duties. So certainly so, I would have had a certain degree of sway at various royal and local courts.
What would your garments have looked like on a day-to-day basis, and also for ceremonial or high events? What would that have looked like?
Excellent question. For day-to-day events, I'm actually going to reference what I'm wearing currently because it is very much what would have been the norm for the period. So far as garmentry itself, I am going to stand up because it is just this very simple wrapped kilt, which, as we can see, is just a very plain tabby weave. It has a little bit of fringe, which we can see hanging off the side, which it seems to have been the norm for the men to fold their garments on the right with the fringe hanging down. Fringe was a major decorative element in the period, and that lasted from the earliest dynastic period all the way through to the Assyrians, where you see these elaborately fringed cloaks that they would wear. Now, this is also held in place with this lovely bronze pin, which in period could be made out of a variety of materials. There's a number that we have where they're actually made of gold or silver, where the head is lapis lazuli. But there are also examples that mimic those in cheaper materials like bronze and copper. Naturally, in a mundane respect, can't afford gold, but certainly that's what my jewelry would have been in period. I also have my bangle bracelets, which are based on extant finds that we found throughout the Mesopotamian region at various points in history, because even though the region was chaotic, it seemed that a lot of their cultural norms kind of maintained throughout history, changing really only when technology improved. I have my string of carnelian beads, which was a very popular stone imported from both Anatolia as well as the Indus River Valley. On my other necklace, which we have these lovely bicone beads, I also have my cylinder seal, which is essentially the equivalent of a signet ring. Cylinder seals basically would indicate the identity of the wearer, and they would be rolled across the wet clay of the tablets that they recorded things on, essentially as a personal signature. Now, cylinder seals traditionally would be made out of precious gemstones or minerals. Mine is made out of bronze, and it has just some simple geometric shapes, which are based on extant finds from the Pennsylvania Museum, where we have a lot of Sumerian artifacts. But we've seen everything from simple geometric shapes to entire scenes of divinities with horned headdresses and wings standing on lions holding spears. So it really depended on who the cylinder seal was owned by as to the level of adornment. I do also have a ring, and in period, I may also have had small lunate earrings, some hair rings. I do have a diadem, but it's not with me currently. I've ordered it recently because the quest to improve one's appearance is never ending. But all of which are common pieces of jewelry in the period. Finally, of course, all important is the makeup, which would have been worn by both men and women. We have found cosmetic shells. Literally, they would keep their pigments in halves of seashells and be able to use those as containers. Everyone seemed to have worn kohl, both for possible protection from the elements and disease, as well as because highlighting the eyes seemed to have been a really important cultural force for them. the Sumerians, in a lot of their votive statuary, anyone who's taken like an art history class knows that we have tons of these statues that are just like with these huge, huge eyes. So they really emphasize the eye region. I also do have some lip color as well. The Sumerians had a wide variety of different pigments, and we can be relatively sure that even men would have used makeup in different ways, since we found male grave sites with different types of pigment in it. But this is what I would have worn on a day-to-day basis. So far as for ritual attire or for special occasions, it most likely would have been probably a wrap-like robe thrown over one shoulder, probably out of a finer type of material, certainly with fringe for decoration. And we do have examples of these kinds of garments in statuary, since, of course, no extant textiles from the periods have survived. It's been funny actually trying to research it, because one of the things that keeps coming up is scholars saying that the soil of Mesopotamia, the climate of Mesopotamia, is specifically like very aggressive towards the preservation of textiles. So it's really interesting to try and reconstruct such an early period based on what we see, what's described in like inventory on clay tablets, and then kind of comparing it to contemporary regions like Egypt, where more things do survive. But that's a little bit about my attire. So that's hopefully some good information there. I know I was a bit long-winded, but it's exciting stuff.
No, I love that you have so much information. I mentioned to you earlier that I tried to find a little bit more information, just so I wasn't a complete goob as I'm asking you these questions, to maybe make sure this moves along well. But you kind of touched on it. Do you have any challenges currently with research besides just the lack of information? Is there anything else that you are looking for?
Yes, it can be a little bit challenging, which I both appreciate and also am sometimes frustrated by. Unlike Egypt, which again, I started with in the SCA, and really, not to toot my own horn, I never really had to do much research on it, because I literally grew up reading books about it. It's very accessible to anyone who's interested in it, because it is something that is so popular in the cultural lexicon of even Western history. Comparatively, there's very little about Mesopotamia, and even then, it's typically about the history of the region in general, which, as I keep saying, encompasses the early dynastic period of the Sumerians all the way up to the Assyrians. So really trying to learn more about it, it takes a lot of tenacity, understanding of what you're looking for, knowing how to use the right search terms, and having access to scholarly databases helps as well. But I would say the biggest challenges has been trying to find ways to get the information that I'm really looking for. And fortunately, I do have some excellent individuals who've helped to point me in the right direction. But I also am considering starting to reach out to actual experts in the field to talk to them about it, especially as I do more research on it. One of the biggest hurdles, I would say, is because it is such a niche area and something that, to my knowledge, is virtually unexplored within the SCA. I don't know of anyone who has done specifically Neo-Sumerian. There are a few individuals who have touched on different aspects of the Bronze Age, and even in Trimaris, currently Baroness Anna Doikiana Sirakusina, hopefully I didn't butcher her name. She's done a lot of great research recently with Hittite. She actually did some initial research on Mesopotamia that helped to guide me, but specifically getting this in depth with the Neo-Sumerian Empire, no one to my knowledge has ever done anything of that nature. And it can be a little daunting, both not having people to turn to and say, hey, where do point me in the right direction, where should I go, as well as perhaps to a certain degree, people who understand it or are interested in it. I'm very curious to see how, when I finish this most recent Attire project, who they'll ask to judge it, because it is something that not too many people know about. But again, that's part of the fun for me, is really being able to explore new areas and break new ground in something like this. And I really like to take on that kind of challenge.
So, are there any other challenges in the SCA involving this culture and you actually portraying this persona, aside from just not having people that know about it?
Certainly so. I would say that, especially within relatively recent years, the scope of the SCA has broadened a lot, which I personally greatly appreciate. But there are some people in there who still have very much a viewpoint that the SCA is just for medieval and Renaissance Europe, which is certainly not the case. I think it's very important that we explore earlier periods of history, especially other geographic regions. So trying to sometimes combat that kind of Eurocentric thinking is a little bit of a challenge, and maybe even a little bit frustrating, especially since these kinds of cultures really influenced and to a certain degree allowed the later periods to become what they were. Beyond that, just kind of some people don't really take it seriously. In my experience, I've had a few instances of people who thought my studies were a joke and that I hadn't fully researched it. I've had people who have, even to a certain degree, been a bit rude about my garb, asking, like, oh, well, what do you wear underneath your kilt? And it's like, wouldn't you like to know?
Not your business.
But overall, one of the things I will say is that I really appreciate about Trimaris is that I have, on the most part, always felt welcomed and appreciated for the work that I've done, been very much encouraged by my laurel, by other peers, by our kings and queens. And I think in a lot of other places in the known world, people are really saying, hey, it's great that we have so many people who love the 14th century and Norse and the Elizabethan, but it's also great that we have people who are doing, Egyptian and Greek and Minoan and all these other more niche, less researched cultures. So I really am looking forward to hopefully seeing more of that in the future. We're always going to have plenty of medieval and Renaissance people, and that's great because there's always new stuff to learn and discover, but also being able to make these new discoveries in different areas, I think is just going to serve to enrich the group and really help us all to learn and know and do more with it.
So, the SCA obviously was built on the foundations of Eurocentric studies. I even believe that was initially what the wording was in the beginning. How do you see the diverse studies fitting in with the Eurocentric climate? And I ask that because even though we have broadened the scope of cultural studies, which, as you said, is great, there is still very much the way crown is fought. The court is all very European centric. So how can we, as a society that is sort of been bred on it being Eurocentric, incorporate the diverse cultures such as the Neo-Sumerians, the Minoans, in Egypt? And because, it's so far apart, how do we bring you into the court environment to give you that place to display yourself and really show what the cultures are about?
Excellent question. I think the most important thing is, first and foremost, to recognize and highlight the individuals out there who are researching these areas. Certainly make sure that when they're presenting classes, art side projects, fighting kits, it's important both as royals and as a populace to encourage them in those pursuits. Bringing it into the court itself, It's, I think, very important to recognize and highlight the differences between those earlier civilizations, but also a lot of the similarities there. One of the things that I find incredibly fascinating about ancient Egypt, for example, is how much pomp and ritual goes into their courts. And it may be a little different from what you had in Europe, but the spirit of it is very much the same. And I think that really the creative part of our name is supposed to be about creatively exploring how these cultures would work in the setting of what we do. Because being able to look at things like heraldry with banners, things like different types of art, how crown is fought, how people behave in court, even though the SCA is very solidly based in medieval and Renaissance Europe, I think that there are a lot of similarities to other cultures in Africa, Asia, the Near East, in earlier time periods, that we can really kind of see and learn ways to apply in that kind of structure. And probably doing so would see that they're not necessarily as different as we think they are. Finding fun ways to incorporate it, different types of shtick, but also including research into it, really backing it up and showing really how these kind of cultures were different and yet similar. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. And I know if I was ever to have a coronation, that I would want to make sure as king, or I suppose royal consort, because I'm not the fighter type, that I would want to ensure that even though I keep the spirit of what the SCA does being grounded in medievalism, I would really bring in a lot of the earlier ancient culture, a lot of the non-European culture, and really highlight how much it is similar in spirit, if not necessarily exactly the same.
So before we end this, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to talk about, or, just let people know about the Neo-Sumerian culture, your persona, that maybe we hadn't thought about as we're discussing everything?
I'm trying to think. I think what really the only other thing that maybe we haven't covered is I think really just the importance of highlighting artisans and scholars within the organization who really do work in these different and niche fields. And it's not even necessarily the Bronze Age Near East. We have amazing artisans in our society who do a variety of different crafts, really even crafts within medieval and Renaissance Europe that maybe aren't necessarily practiced as much. Really being able to highlight those who focus in areas that aren't as well explored, I think that only lends to really the knowledge, to the power of our organization as we try to recreate the best aspects of history. And we should really encourage those people. It only makes us better as a whole to be able to see what all of us are able to create and how that contributes to the dream at large. And I think that that's the most important thing that anyone should do, whether you're a member of the populace or a sitting crown. Really go out there, find someone who isn't following the trend of things, and really encourage them, because sometimes that bit of encouragement can really help them to do some amazing and unique things. And I've had the blessing of that in my personal experience, and I would want that for others in the society as well.
Thank you so much for that bit of advice for everyone to take in and really let that simmer so they can think about how they can in the future help others. I appreciate that. So I want to say thank you. Thank you for being my first cultural diversity interview. And I think I'm going to come back to you so we can discuss some Egyptian stuff too in the future. I hope that you'd be willing to do that as well.
I would absolutely be willing to do so. I have a lot of experience there.
All right. Thank you so much. And you have a great night.